Okay, so let's begin with a JFK in Vietnam, links to a cold case, the assassination of JFK, and we're exploring in this slide set the first clues to the case. It was a 4-year odyssey discovering JFK's decision to withdraw from Vietnam, but there were so many parts along the way, keys to unlock several doors. But it all began in late 1987. I was traveling in a small U.S. Army jet with the National Security Agency Director, Lieutenant General William E. Odom. At the time, I was his military assistant. We were on our way to a naval intelligence facility in the Carolinas, where Odom would deliver a presentation on the Soviet battlefield development plan. At length, Odom put down his New York Times and asked about the subject of my PhD dissertation. I replied that it was on the succession to Mao Zedong. And so then, that day, there was a decision that changed my destiny. General Odom's reaction was actually surprising. Oh, come on, why don't you do something more imaginative and really tackle something important? Step outside of your safety box and show some mettle. For a moment, I was speechless. But Odom was right. A tradition in American academe holds that, ideally, a PhD should overturn an orthodoxy or break new ground, or both. And I realized there would be no turning back from this moment. And without careful consideration of how best to respond, I replied, "Look, General Odom, what if I told you that President Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam at the time he died?" Odom said, "If you could make a strong case for that, it would be a great dissertation." And then he went back to his New York Times. The reason I said that is because all the academic books at the time were saying that Kennedy would have done exactly the same thing that Johnson did in Vietnam. And I believed, and I do today, the case for that is wrong, that it's just the opposite. So that night back at Fort Meade, I could hardly wait to call my mentor and PhD program advisor at George Washington University, Dr. Richard C. Thornton. As it turned out, he was still up and answered my phone call. So I said, "Dick, I want to change the subject of my dissertation." And he replied, "To what?" I said, "To JFK in Vietnam." After a couple of seconds, his response was surprising. "I thought you'd never ask." So I completed my coursework and comprehensive exams and received approval for the PhD dissertation topic, JFK in Vietnam, Deception, Intrigue, and the Struggle for Power. I elected to take the maximum period, 4 years, for researching and writing the dissertation. I traveled to several archives around the country, including the Center for Military History at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, and its office in Washington, D.C. Along the way, I was also stationed at the U.S. Army Intelligence School at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, in the summer of 1988, a 6-month PCS, which allowed me to bring my family with me. Turns out that at Fort Huachuca, where I was there actually for a military intelligence advanced course, that the Military Intelligence Museum for the whole country was on the base at Fort Huachuca. Before long, I visited the museum to see what I could find. And there I met the director of the museum, Colonel retired Don Blasek. He had served in Vietnam during the Kennedy years and later under then Brigadier General Joseph McChristian, the intelligence chief of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, during Westmoreland's command of MACV from 1964 to 1968. Well, my time there with Don Blasek opened up a dormant passage at Fort Huachuca. Before I move on, I want to talk about my feelings for General Joseph A. McChristian. He was the finest military intelligence officer ever to wear the uniform. McChristian served as General Patton's G2 intelligence officer during World War II, during the breakout from Normandy and the dash across Europe to Berlin. General Westmoreland ended McChristian's Vietnam tour at MACV in June 1967 because of McChristian's insistence on telling the truth about the size and determination of the Viet Cong. Later, McChristian became the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, actually at Headquarters, U.S. Army. McChristian was there that day to be inducted into the Military Hall of Fame. And he heard about me through Don Blasek and asked that I would meet with him. And so I was actually taken out of a class with the rest of the people that were there studying with me and stayed with him for about 3 hours that afternoon. Later on, I learned after McChristian's MACV tour was over, several of his most revealing files deposited at the U.S. Army Center for Military History were robbed and vanished into darkness. And why? It was important evidence about the lying at MACV, and it disappeared when a thief with special access located and destroyed those records. 1962, the year the big lie started in Vietnam. Blasek invited my wife Sue and me to his house for dinner that night. Blasek had worked in MACV intelligence during the presidencies of JFK and LBJ. Years later, Don provided key information for the CBS documentary, CBS Reports, The Uncounted Enemy, A Vietnam Deception, about the lies that had been perpetrated by MACV in 1967 regarding the size of the Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam. When Don heard that I was working on a dissertation about the Kennedy years of the Vietnam War, he immediately declared, "That's when the big lie started." Blasek then gave me something that changed my life. He provided the names of the intelligence officers involved in the same sordid, bald-faced lying in MACV that had taken place earlier in 1962. Don suggested that I approach Sam Adams first. Sam had been an analyst for the CIA working on the Viet Cong order of battle, and Sam also had been the principal consultant for that CBS documentary. Like McChristian's and others, Adams had refused to lie. Sam Adams, pictured in the upper left-hand corner there, provided contacts for the most important intelligence officers that I needed to interview to get to the bottom of this. Sam gave me the locations and phone numbers of several top American military and civilian intelligence officers. At the top of that list was Bill Benedict, who had been working at the Vietnam desk of the Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, actually at the time. Second on that list was George Allen, who had been working on Vietnam issues at the newly created Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. Allen and Benedict had not talked with each other since that seditious experience back in 1962, which later became Chapter 13 of my dissertation and later the book, JFK in Vietnam. Both men gave me the same account about the falsification of the Viet Cong order of battle. I interviewed the senior American advisor in Vietnam at the time, Colonel Dan Boone Porter. He was straight as an arrow. And he wouldn't lie either, and he confirmed their awful report, as did many others. John Paul Van's aide, Major James Drummond, and MACV officers Roland Dutton, Sam Dowling, and Captain Jimmy Harris. And then I had to go to Hong Kong. My family got to go with me for a year out there, where I was studying, being tutored in lots of Chinese dialects to be an attaché in China, and where I could spend my spare time writing on my dissertation. Back in the United States in 1990, I contacted the U.S. Army Center for Military History office located on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. At the Washington office, I was in uniform. I met a nice gentleman there, and I asked him for copies of the U.S. Army Pacific Command, USARPAC, monthly intelligence bulletins for 1962, including the map I'd heard about, if it was still available, that was used to brief Secretary of Defense McNamara at the May 1962 SecDef conference. A pleasant caretaker, this man was, he took me back with him to a safe of documents, classified secret, and said, "Here we are." As he opened it up, and he said, "Look, here's the map too." And then right there on the spot, he declassified the bulletins. And what Benedict and others had told me was the measles map. It was covered all over with red splotches showing Viet Cong concentrations. Actually, I found out later that this was a doctored version of the map on which half of all those red splotches had been removed. So this is actually cutting the Viet Cong in half, a false map. And so I was a proud owner of the entire set of the 1962 United States Army Pacific Monthly Intelligence Bulletins. And it was a real treasure trove. It was documentary evidence that corroborated all the statements of more than a dozen U.S. Army officers who witnessed the Viet Cong order of battle deception. You can see the declassification date that day. I was at the Military History Institute. It was 25 July 1988. And he declassified it right that day. And later on, they became part of the John Newman papers that went up to the JFK library. So I like to talk about this, about something General Christian once said. It really makes me proud to have served in military intelligence when there were officers like him. He was a major contributor to the CBS documentary report. And when CBS producer George Crowell asked him a question, "General, what does it mean to lie about the enemy in a time of war?" This was McChristian's answer. I wish all general officers could make an answer like this. He said, "To lie about the enemy in the time of war jeopardizes not only the lives of the soldiers on the battlefield, but also the future liberty of your people at home." So in summary, I'm on the at that point in my life, I'm on the trail of a Vietnam deception that I had not anticipated, and came to find out that the witnesses and the USAPAC evidence were unknown to McNamara and Kennedy, the Secretary of State and the President. So then, who was behind the order of battle deception, and how was it carried out?